The Periplus of the Erythraean Sea is a book that was written by an explorer from ancient Egypt, 1st century AD, and he wrote in Greek and wrote about the travels that a lot of people, including himself, had done, and he wrote as far as India and even China. Now, the problem with this is that China itself was somewhat ignorant of Africa and even Europe at this time, while Indian traders had been trading there since the 7th century BC. Evidence of Indians in Africa goes back years, centuries, and because of this, the Chinese were fully aware that there must have been other continents or even lands that lay beyond. So, from the perspective of the Chinese, they needed to know what is on the other side of the Middle East. Sima Qian, a historian from China from BC, 100 BC, describes all these fascinating places in the Middle East, but his descriptions stop at daqin, and daqin, which is thought to be Greece or Rome, is not explored. It's said as something that he has heard of from other people. But he did talk about traveling to close areas in the Middle East. Something that is not written in the book of Simichin, which talks about the Western nations. Yezu, the people are settled on the land, cultivating the fields and growing rice and wheat. They also make wine out of grapes. They have walled cities like the people of Daiwan. The regions containing several hundred cities of various sizes. The kingdom, which borders the Gu River, is very large, measuring several thousand li squares. Some of the inhabitants are merchants who travel by carts or boats to neighboring countries, sometimes journeying several thousand li. The coins of the country are made of silver and bear the face of the king. When the king dies, the currency is immediately changed, and new coins issued with the face of his successor. The people keep records by writing horizontally on a strip of leather. To the west lies Tiazao, or Mesopotamia, and to the north Yangsai and Liashan, Hirakan, or the Turkish regions. Tiazao is situated several thousand li west of Angshi and borders the Western Sea, the Persian Gulf. It is hot and damp, and the people live by cultivating the fields and planting rice. In this region live great birds which lay eggs as large as pots. The people are very numerous and are ruled by many petty chiefs. The ruler of Angshi gives orders to these chiefs and regards them as his vassals. The people are skillful at performing tricks that amaze the eye. The old men of Angshi say they have heard that the Taozao are to be found in the river of the weak water and the Queen Mother of the West, though they admit that they have never seen either of them. Dakshia is situated 2,000 li southeast of Daiwan, south of the Gu River. Its people cultivate the land and have cities and houses. Their customs are like those of Daiwan. It has no great ruler, but only a number of petty chiefs ruling a various cities. The people are poor in the use of arms and afraid of battle, but they are clever at commerce. After the great Yezu moved west and attacked and conquered Dakshia, the entire country came under their sway. The population of the country is large, numbering some 1 million or some more persons. The capital is called the large city of Langshi or Bactra, and has a market where all sorts of goods are brought and sold. Southeast of Dakshia is the kingdom of Shendu or India. When I was in Dakshia, Shang Qian reported, I saw bamboo canes from Chong and cloth made in the province of Shu. When I asked the people how they had gotten such articles, they replied, "Our merchants go to buy them at the market of Shendu." Shendu, they told me, lies several thousand li southeast of Dakshia. The people cultivate the land and live much like the people of Dakshia. The region is said to be hot and damp. The inhabitants ride elephants when they go into battle. The kingdom is situated on a great river. We know that Dakshia is located 12,000 li southwest of China. Now, if the kingdom of Shendu is situated several thousand li southeast of Dakshia, and obtains goods which are produced in Shu, it seems to me that it must not be very far away from Shu. At present, if we try to send envoys to Dakshia by way of the mountain trails, the lead through the territory of the Qiang people, they will be molested by the Qiang, while if we send them a little further north, they will be captured by the Xiongnu. It would seem that the most direct route, as well as the safest, would be that out of Shu. Thus the emperor learned of Daiwan, Dakshi, Anxi, and others, all great states rich in unusual products, whose people cultivate the land and made their living in much of the same way as the Chinese. All these states, he was told, were militarily weak and prized Han goods and wealth. He also learned that to the north of them lived the Yezu and Kangju, people who were strong in arms but who could be persuaded by gifts and the prospect of gain to acknowledge allegiance to the Han court. If it were possible to win over these states by peaceful means, the emperor thought, he could then extend his domain 10,000 li, attract to his court men of strange customs who would come translating and retranslating their languages, and his might would become known to all of the lands within the four seas. The emperor was therefore delighted and approved Shang Qian's suggestion. He ordered Shang Qian to start out from Juanwei in Shu on the secret mission to search for Daxia. The party broke up into four groups proceeding out of the regions of Meng, Ran, Shi, and Qiong and Po. All the groups managed to advance 1,000 or 2,000 li, but they were blocked on the north by the Di Zhao tribes, and on the south by the Sioux and Kunming tribes. The coming tribes have no rulers, but devote themselves to plunder and robbery, and as soon as they are seized, any of the Han envoys, they immediately murder them. Thus, none of the parties were ever able to get through to their destination. They did learn, however, that some 1,000 or more li to the west there was a state called Dianwei, whose people rode elephants, and that the merchants of Shu sometimes went there with their goods on unofficial trading missions. In this way, the Han, while searching for the route to Daxia, first came into contact with the kingdom of Dian. Earlier, the Han and had tried to establish relations with the barbarians of the southwest, but the expanse proved too great, and no road could be found through the regions, and so the project was abandoned. After Zhang Qian reported that it was possible to reach Daxia by traveling through the region of the southwestern barbarians, the Han once more began efforts to establish relations with the tribes in the area. Now, while that is an impressive amount of knowledge that Sima Qian shows, it's not new to the Chinese. The Chinese had known about Afghanistan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, India, and other regions. I mean, as far as Japan, Korea, Indonesia, and all the rest by about the 7th century BC. So, and there's actually written records about this. So, this isn't a revolutionary book. The thing that they were trying to do was to sum up what was happening so that they could go further than this point. Unfortunately, you can see right there that the people of the Middle East guarded their territory with all their might. And why would they do this? Why would they bother? Well, we do know that lying just on the other side of the Middle East, which the Chinese were fully ignorant of, are two great continents. These continents, of course, had been visited by the Indians, so the Indians were fully aware. And had the Chinese been more curious to ask the Indians how they made their way to these vast places, they would have had the knowledge greater than trying to walk through land, which probably seemed simpler at the time. But the two that lay on the other side were Africa and Europe. What would then happen after that is that explorers from China would try again and again and again to go beyond this area, failing a couple times. And of course, the Europeans would make their way into China very far back. In fact, there are Chinese books that go back about the same time as Sima Qian that talk about the the explorers of China landing, or the explorers of Europe landing in China. Or at least they call them explorers from the West. Maybe they were from Europe, who knows? They could have been from Egypt. Now, a couple things. Obviously, we can't take everything that the sources say to heart, including Herodotus and all of them. We can't take every single thing they say to the fullest because, of course, they may misinterpret things. For example, I mean, I think a lot of the civilizations which they say dedicate themselves to robbery would definitely say, if coming from their perspective, they were not robbers or thieves, but instead were capturing certain foreigners and stuff like that who would infiltrate their territories and then rob them, but they were doing commerce within each other, and that you can't really have a state that is dedicated to robbery. In the same way that Herodotus describes the people of Egypt when he's talking about them doing their dances as, they try to make the most offensive dances, and they start to show certain parts of their body and stuff like that in offensive manner. I think from the perspective of the Egyptians that he's writing about, they would definitely wouldn't say that that's what they were doing. Like, hey, we're trying to offend people. In real life, what was, because of course, who you gonna offend? I mean, they weren't doing it for the Romans; they were doing it for themselves. What they were really doing was just dancing, but the dance was so wild or unexpected compared to what the Greeks had seen that they describe it in a completely different manner. This is one of the problems, and I'd say solutions, of history, in that it's a problem because obviously, if you read one perspective, then you get one perspective, and then that's it, right? That's what you believe. But if you read multiple perspectives of the same encounter, what you then see is how other people see things that do not belong to their own customs. And of course, in ancient Egypt, they would consider themselves as highly organized, whereas Herodotus sort of shows that they're highly organized for the most part, but then starts to interpret things that he does not understand as chaos. Speaking of Herodotus, he is one of the great evidences that the people of India traded with Africa going far back. Because remember, in Herodotus's book, we have Indians stationed as close as the Red Sea, and we know in the periplus of the Erythraean Sea that Middle Eastern merchants would meet Indian boats at the Red Sea, which were trading with African boats. And we know during the Arabic times that the Arabs would allow Indian boats to trade with African boats unmolested. So, drawing a map of what is really happening, you can see that the country that is left out, or the continent, or the whatever you want to call it, that is left out, is not Africa. It's not even India. It's not Europe. It's not the Middle East. It's China. China, of course, still gaining a lot of the trade. I mean, rhino horns, we know, were making their way all the way to China, but this did not stop them from being completely ignorant of these places. And so we go to another Chinese person who too would fail to reach Africa or Europe. From the University of Wales, Trinity St. David, conceptualizing the Far West, early Chinese notions of daqin and the Indian Ocean trade. Now, it's important to understand that daqin didn't necessarily mean Rome as it's been interpreted today, but in fact could be a mix of several Western civilizations, that Western meaning west of China, which they did not know about. So obviously they would know, like, okay, these people are from the Middle East because they've run into Middle Easterners. But in some cases, they would run into Africans, or they would run into a type of Middle Eastern group that they had never met before, the ones that don't represent Persian or those near regions. And because of this, they would make the estimation that these people come from Dachin. But remember, a lot of these would be guesses, and a lot of these people who wrote about Dachin were hundreds of years apart, so they did not know if they were talking about the exact same location. In some cases, they would even be talking about Roman Egypt. So the people come from Roman Egypt and they say, oh, these are the people from Dachin. What does that mean? As we read, conceptualizing the Far West, early Chinese notions of Dachin and the Indian Ocean trade by Matthew A. Cobb. In the Liang Shu, a 7th century Chinese history primarily covering the period 502 to 557 CE, a curious incident is reported about the arrival of a merchant called Qin Lu on the coast of Jiazhou in 226 CE, a region equating to the Red River Delta in Vietnam. This merchant, who is said to have been from Da Chin, literally Great Chin, a term often interpreted by many modern scholars as referring to the Roman Empire, was sent by the perfect or the prefect of Jiaozi to the ruler Sun Xian, 222 to 252 CE, of the state of Wu, who was asked to provide a report on his native country and its people. After being gifted men and women, boys and girls, 10 of each, Qin Lu returned home. It is stated in the passage directly preceding this anecdote that the merchants from Daqin frequently visit Funan, a prefecture of the Mekong Delta, as well as Renan and Jizao. But few of the inhabitants of these southern frontier states have traveled to Daqin. If it is accepted that Daqin does in fact refer to the Roman Empire in this instance, and that this comment is directly connected to the anecdote about Qin Lun, then we would, on the face of it, appear to have attested I hate that word, testimonies of supposed frequent travel by merchants from the Roman Empire to the areas along the coast of what is today Vietnam during the early 3rd century CE, possibly also from the end of the 2nd century CE. However, this seems an unlikely proposition given our understanding of the levels of the direct participation by Roman merchants in the Indian Ocean trade at this time, as is clear from the intensity of the occupation of the key Egyptian Red Sea ports. Now, there is a greater context to this reading as to the location of daqin, so I will link it so that you guys can read it yourself. If you want to, comment one. If you want me to read the whole thing, I'll just upload it as a full reading. I have it, but I'm not going to read it this time because I don't know what people want, but let's just see their one of their conclusions about what daqin is. The products of daqin. Discussions of the products of daqin perhaps has more pertinence with the regards to Indian Ocean trade. McLaughlin, working on the assumption that the Wheelie and Howe Hanshu faithfully reproduce information appearing in its original reports regarding these texts as being able to provide information about Roman products reaching the Far East. The former text associating daqin with some 59 products. He even suggests that many of the goods, which are clearly from other regions such as Arabia and India, were reprocessed and re-exported items from Roman workshops. On the face of it, it might be tempting to accept this premise, at least in part, since some of the products listed in our Chinese text do in fact derive from the Roman Empire. These include gold, silver, various base metals, glass, red coral, asbestos, cloth, re- real gar, storax, orpiment, and saffron. A few of the products, like red coral, were in fact regarded across many cultures, while storax and glassware appear to have been particularly appreciated in China. It might even be tempting to give some credence to the claim made in the Waylay about the people of Daqin reworking imported Chinese silk and reselling it at a profit. This is because what seems to be corroborated evidence appears in a few Greco-Roman sources. Pliny mentions women of the empire dividing threads of silk and then reweaving them to make a lighter, more gauze-like fabric. A practice also briefly alluded in Lucian's Pharsalia. Furthermore, there is a reference to the edict of maximum prices to a variety of reworked silks, including dyed and embroidered products. However, there are reasons to be more circumspect in the case of the notions of reworking woven silk products. Hildebrandt observes that any such product would damage the fabric. She argues that instead Lucian may have alluded to a diaphanous, purple dyed silk grown or gown that was formerly a plissé fabric but stretched to make it transparent, and that Pliny is taking was talking about the unraveling of cocoons, not woven fabrics. Furthermore, reasons for doubt also derives from the fact that daqin need not automatically designate peoples from the Roman world. The existence of reasonably developed silk industry in India in the early historic period should at least give us pause about whether the claim made in the Waylay necessarily reflects accurate Chinese knowledge of Roman practices regarding silk processing with regard to the range of items listed as products of daqin. Most of these, as noted, clearly derive from the regions such as East Africa, ivory, rhinoceros horn, Southern Arabia, frankincense and myrrh, the Persian Gulf regions, pearls, India, Duna, rock crystal, pearls, ivory, carnelian, and Southeast Asia, rather than attempt to claim that all of these items were repossessed and re exported from the Roman Empire, it seems more plausible to suggest that they were conflated with daqin as a powerful semi utopian kingdom in the distant West, and that these authors were simply not in the position to clearly distinguish the origins of these products. This confusion and lack of clarity about the origin of particular imported products is not an unusual phenomenon. For example, there was a persistent and a erroneous belief repeated in Greco-Roman literature that cinnamon, cassia, and nard came from Arabia. It may also be possible to draw certain parallels with the list of products from Dachin given in the Wele and Ho Hanshu with Buddhist ideas that made their way into China. In Mahayana Buddhism, there is a concept of seven treasures. In the great event, an important Mayahan text, these seven consist of crystal or quartz, pearls, lapis lazuli, gold, silver, red coral, and agate or coral. Later texts substitute rubies or diamonds. These items became features of Buddhism. Heavens and also came to constitute elements of the immortal trees of Taoist paradise. All of these items are listed in the Wele with the exception of lapis lazuli, but these could be understood as being subsumed within the various semi-precious gems category. This appears similarly to be the case with the slightly less extensive list in the Hao Hanshu. Before we finalize the last part of this reading, let's summarize what we've been reading, which is the first of all, let's just look at the arguments which are solid, which are you can't conclude from the Chinese, who in the beginning we read had never even gone past the Middle East, that they know for a fact that the people that they're talking about are from the Roman Empire. Secondly, we can't conclude from this that there are other people who did not come from different regions and land. Now, Dachin meaning the Great Chin, which they're talking about, well, modern people interpret it as Rome or the Roman Empire. Here's the problem, many problems. One, these are several different times. So the Roman Empire shrank and grew and shrank and grew. So how could they know specifically which parts it was? But also the materials that came from several different locations. That came from India, China, well, India, Rome, Africa, the Middle East. How can you conclude that, and even Southeast Asia, how can you conclude that all of those were taken from the Romans? The answer couldn't be more clear. This is actually evidence of, if they are correct about what they're saying, this is evidence of multiple people traveling from multiple different places and entering China from Southeast Asia, which of course the Romans would have very little access to those regions, from Africa, from the Middle East, and from India by boat traveling. And in fact, this summarizes the Indian Ocean. And in fact, there's more writings about Dachin and what the people might have looked like, and the fact that some of them wore gold and all this other stuff, which we will not look at today. But still, there's more information about this. And that Dachin, that's been taken to mean the Roman Empire, because it later meant, those specific regions, especially with Justinian. Now, another thing that, I'm going to contradict a video I made recently, actually the previous one, is that it is possible that Justinian was the first to, used the silkworm, but it's also possible that other people outside of Justinian's people figured out the silkworm because they traded with China directly. Okay, continue reading, which actually mentions bluish greenish gems, quite possibly referring to lapis lazuli. While Daqin was understood as a terrestrial empire, the fact that it was in the far west near the location where paradise was situated, at least in certain religious philosophical creeds like variants of Buddhism and Taoism, may explain why these products were associated with this empire. The suggestion is, of course, speculative. The next title heading is Dachin as a nebulous concept, and this is basically their conclusion. Given the contested debate in modern scholarship regarding exactly what Dechin refers to, and the exact or the fact that many mythic religious concepts are associated with it, we should consider questioning whether our Chinese authors had a precise, consistent, and coherent sense of this land. In consequence, this has obvious implications for the way in which we understand the reference to the merchant from Dachin frequently sailing to Vietnam, mentioned in the Liang Shu. The notion that a term that designates an other ethnic cultural group might be vague, imprecise, and fluid, open to being understood differently from context to context, should not be surprising. The type of problem has a number of historical parallels. For example, the term Yavana in origin appears to have been used in parts of India to designate Greek speaking peoples. It generally assumed that the Persian term for Ionians, Ioana, was transmuted into the Prakrit Yona and Sanskrit Yavana. However, by the early to mid century of the first millennium CE, it appears to have become much broader in meaning, not necessarily just designating Greek speakers, and could be understood in different terms, as appears to be in the case of Sangam literature of the Tamil cultures, as well as inscriptional evidence from the Deccan and the island of Socotra. Similarly, the Greco Roman designation of Ethiopians, a people that are broadly associated with Northeast Africa, could, depending on the period and the context, be associated with the Meroitic kingdom, or by the 3rd century, if not earlier, with the Aksum kingdom. Similarly, some authors, classical authors, conflate India and Ethiopia, and at least by the late antique period, the term India, sometimes distinguished between India Major and India Minor, could include regions like East Africa. This potential ambiguity should be borne in the mind when considering the description of Dachin and its people in textual sources. Now, the one I know the most about that they make there, the two of India Minor and India Major, where sometimes they refer to East Africa, but there's also the Mesopotamians who sometimes well, not sometimes, they definitely made the reference to some places which were India later as Africa, but I forgot the name of them. I'll look it up. But if you look at also Ethiopia, the word Ethiopia, though it meant East Africa in some cases, this was because they ran into those places first. But you will see that there are other Greco-Roman sources that call the Ethiopia the entire continent of Africa. In some cases, they call only the parts south of the north, obviously, as Ethiopia, and then the lands above they have their own names, especially the parts that they had conquered. Also, sometimes they refer to Egypt as Ethiopia, and sometimes they don't. Sometimes they say Ethiopia, not referring to Egypt or outside of Egypt. One author, one who was very ignorant, also claimed that the Ethiopians come from India and that there was a land somewhere in the middle of India and Africa, and they separated from that place. Now, obviously, knowing genetics today, it's a very ignorant thing to say, and was probably born of the fact that Indians and Africans have similar skin color. Back to the reading, we also need to be cognizant of the fact that Chinese historical texts, as has been discussed, usually followed their predecessors when describing foreign countries and situations. Indeed, it is of interest that the texts dating several centuries after the initial composition of the Wele and Honhanshu appear to transpose a number of ideas connected to daqin, with Fulin, the latter usually being interpreted as referring to Byzantine, making meaning some of the descriptions and designations repeated in later texts may represent fossilized ideas, which can become distorted in the process of conflation of earlier, sometimes more accurate predecessors. This adds a further layer of complication when thinking about knowledge transfer and how much a can genuinely be taken as reports that resulted from trade contacts. He goes on to say, ultimately, it is not my intention to claim that these early Chinese texts have no use in the study of Indian Ocean and South China Sea networks of exchange, commercial and cultural, of the early mid first millennium CE. However, I hope to have demonstrated that these reports need to be treated with a great deal of circumspection. Now, of course, Eastern sources aren't the only sources that we have for Africa. We have, of course, Ptolemy, who wrote in his geography about Rapta and Aramata, where spices are taken and shifted around the world, which Aramata is in the Horn of Africa. Rapta is somewhere inside or in Central Africa or Central East Africa. It's never been found, but there are some clues to where exactly it is. We know it's not in the north. We know it's not too far to the south because they mentioned the Zanj regions after this, which are in the south. And this is what he had to say. Concerning the voyage from Aramata to Rapta, Marinus tells us that a certain Diogenes, one of those who were accustomed to sail to India, having been driven out of his course and being off the coast Aramata, was caught by the north wind, and after having sailed with Troglodytica on his right, came in 25 days to the lake from which the Nile flows, to the south of which lies the promontory of Raptum. He tells us also that a certain Theophilus, one of those who were accustomed to sail to Azania, driven from Rapta by the south wind, came to Aramata on the 20th day. In neither of these cases does he tell us how many days were occupied in the actual sailing, but merely states that Theophilus took 20 days and Diogenes, who sailed along the coast of Troglodytica, took 25 days. Now, I want to remind you that when we're talking about Rapta, we're not talking about any place outside of Africa, or even when we talk of Aramatica or Aramata, we're not talking about a place outside of Africa. We're talking about Africa proper. And there's a reason why I'm saying this. And the reason why I'm saying this is because there's so many references in of geography of location that make it obvious where these locations are. For example, he mentions Arabia Felix, which is about Yemen, and from there he says opposite that there's Aramatica or Aramata, which is in there, and then all of a sudden he says you move westward, you get to Rapta, you move southwards, you get to the Zanj regions. So it's unlike the older version in Egypt when they mention the areas of the Horn of Africa where they leave it up to interpretation, where some people have taken it to mean maybe Saudi Arabia or some other place. In this case, they mean definitely these specific locations. And the fact that they mention empires in those regions, stone walls, clothes being weaved in those regions, tells you how old the tradition is. But of course, this is not about clothes or any of that. It has to do with the connection between India and daqin and all these other places in history that communicated with each other. Well, we can see here that there were some people from as far as Europe who did go to India. And of course, from the Chinese sources, we know that people from the West, meaning Africa, west of China, they did go to those regions. So we have multiple sources from multiple parts of the world that detail multiple people traveling multiple times from one place to the other. We even in this book of Ptolemy, we have them documenting boats traveling from Arabia Felix all the way into Rapta and from Rapta to Arabia Felix. So probably the most annoying thing about this history is not that it is lost or unknown, it's that it's so easy to piece together, yet still people look at it like a vague, because of course when people say when did trade between India and Africa outside of Egypt start, they say about the 7th century. There's proof everywhere that that couldn't be the case and that it started somewhere. If you were being charitable to the other side, you would say 7th century BC. And of course, like I said, trade does not always mean you want stuff that you don't have in your own land, but instead you might value, for example, rhinoceros horns. Why are rhinoceros horns being taken there? Well, it might have to do with preserving their rhino instead of, getting rid of their rhino. If there's a bunch of people who are okay with getting rid of their rhino specifically, then they can keep the horns. Oh yeah, and finally I want to say about the silk thing. Like I said, I made a video about it saying that it was Justinian who brought it to these regions and probably brought it to Africa. But again, that's based on specific authors and specific people who say this. We do not know if the people did not discover it in some other way in India, the Middle East, or even Africa. So globalization might have been a thing way before we thought, and that we lost that at some point, but later we brought it back in the strongest way possible. Now, not every region in the world didn't globalize, but what I mean is Europeans. Now, again, the word frequent is a scary word because, of course, oh yeah, that was one of the points I wanted to make. One of the reasons why it seems like there was so many missions to China at the time could explain the fact that it was multiple people from multiple civilizations, and then they think it's a lot, they're coming there a lot of times, when in real life it's different civilizations. Thank you. Oh, subscribe, like, share, everything.